It's 1898 and Reconstruction is over. America's Gilded Age has come crashing down, resulting in J.P. Morgan bailing out the United States. What would become the strongest nation on Earth was still in its infancy in the eyes of the old world. But all that would change this year. The recent acquisition of Hawaii has led to its annexation, the first of America's holdings in the Pacific, now an official part of the country. Chapter 1. The Spanish-American War. The Spanish Empire, once one of the most dominant empires in the world, has seen its empire slowly crumble over time. By 1898, their Caribbean and Pacific holdings, specifically Cuba and the Philippines, were in full rebellion. The Spanish were putting people into camps called reconcentrados, coining the phrase concentration camps. It should be noted, however, that these camps cannot compare to the extermination camps created by Nazi Germany 30 years later. These Spanish camps were made to keep people away from outside violence, though some atrocities did take place. While many looked on in horror, Spain struggled to keep her empire together. It was thought that it would be easy to take advantage of the situation and capture, as well as annex, many of the Spanish colonies for themselves. The idea of potentially annexing Cuba was not a new concept. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to President Monroe in 1823,
"I candidly confess that I have ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states. The control which, with Florida Point, this island could give us over the Gulf of Mexico, and the countries and isthmus bordering it, as well as all those whose waters flow into it, would fill up the measure of our political well-being."
The United States foreign policy had been driven for some time by the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that America's sphere of influence was the Northern Hemisphere, and that all European powers had to cease expansion into the region. So America decided to dock one of its most prestigious battleships, the USS Maine, in Havana Harbor in order to keep an eye on the developments in Cuba. The Warhawks got their wish when on February 15, 1898, at 9:40 p.m., the USS Maine suddenly exploded. The explosion killed 266 men on board. It was thought at the time that the Maine had been struck by a Spanish mine. However, this assumption would be proven false many decades later. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that the U.S. Navy determined this explosion was caused by a fire in a coal bunker, which set off the ship's nearby ammunition. A freak accident. A freak accident that would have grave consequences. A month later, on March 27th, President McKinley, who was elected the year prior, was weighing his options. He had no desire to go to war with Spain. He had just sent an overture for peace, which went ignored by the Spanish. Their leaders, to their own detriment, viewed McKinley as weak-minded. While McKinley was doing his best to navigate this tricky situation, the drums of war started to beat louder. No better example than in one particular man in the United States who wanted a war to help sell his newspapers, William Randolph Hearst, of Hearst Newspapers. He was a titan of communication in America and had well over 1 million readers of his paper. Hearst would routinely share sometimes sensationalized stories of the Spanish brutality on the islands. Hearst sent Frederick Remington, a famous illustrator, with a mission to Cuba. Hearst gave his instruction.
"You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war."
Hearst was not alone in his desire for a war, however. Then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, would also speak out in favor of going to war, though under the guise of saving Cuba and the Philippine Islands from the evils of the Spanish Empire. Another prominent American, the highly influential Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, would lobby his fellow congressmen and senators to support going to war, in order to force President McKinley's hand. Almost another month goes by. But by April 11th, the war is now politically unavoidable. President McKinley would even begin to promote the war himself. 8 days later, April 19, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain, with the pretext of helping the Cuban and Filipino people out, as well as getting revenge for the Maine. The battle cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," was chanted throughout the United States. America at the time only had about 24,000 men in the army. The Spanish, on the other hand, had hundreds of thousands. However, they were spread thin throughout the empire's holdings. In order to grow America's fighting force, Congress passed the Volunteer Army Act, which enticed many to sign up and fight. Theodore Roosevelt would resign as Assistant Secretary and join the war, fighting alongside his almost mythical crew, the Rough Riders. Though the Rough Riders would get the press and the glory, there was another group who had to operate in some of the roughest and bloodiest parts of the war. The Black American Soldier, also sometimes known as the Buffalo Soldier. Segregated from their fellow white comrades in arms, it was thought that the unit would not be able to cohesively function if ever integrated. However, it should be noted that the U.S. Navy had, at this point, never been segregated like the Army was, nor did they have any issues functioning cohesively. There was one major proponent of using black soldiers equally, General John Pershing, who would often be derided as Black Jack. He routinely endorsed black soldiers as equally capable. Though not honored at home at the time, they are remembered today as some of the greatest examples of bravery and resilience in the face of death on the battlefield. 5 Buffalo Soldiers would be awarded the then recently created Medal of Honor for their actions in Cuba and the Philippines. These men were Fitz Lee, Dennis Bell, Augustus Wally, George Wanton, and Isaiah Mays. Among the many signing up to join the conflict would be one young man who would soon become a central figure in American expansionism, a 16-year-old named Smedley Darlington Butler. This future Major General was technically too young to sign up, but as many boys did back then, he faked his age and joined the Marine Corps. Smedley Butler was born to a family of non-practicing Quakers, and his father and grandfather had been members of the House of Representatives. Butler was determined to join the fight. Seeing no way to stop him from sneaking out and joining anyway, Smedley Butler, with his parents' blessing, joined the Marine Corps. With his Quaker background, he would earn his first of many nicknames, the Fighting Quaker. He would eventually become the most decorated Marine in U.S. history, with him and fellow Marine Dan Dailey getting 2 Congressional Medals of Honor each. But at the time, he was simply a young man who wanted to go on an adventure and make something of himself, much like the young country that he would fight for. Though he didn't know it at the time, the Spanish-American War would end up being relatively short. Smedley Butler would not see action in this war. Instead, his soon-to-be Central American and Caribbean adventures would make him a household name. As the United States built up its might with many brave men such as Butler, Spain, on the other hand, could ill afford a war. Though the Old World powers in Europe still viewed the United States as a pushover. Very soon, America would prove those assumptions wrong. May 1st, 1898. Just a few days after America and Spain traded their declarations of war, the first major naval battle off the coast of the Philippine Islands would begin. It took only a few hours, and the entire Spanish fleet in the Pacific would be at the bottom of the ocean. Not a single American ship would be sunk. June 10th. 1 month later, the United States would invade Cuba, landing at Guantanamo Bay. There, they made camp and set up defenses, preparing for later offenses outside of this zone of control. By July 1st, the infamous Battle of San Juan Hill would happen, with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders accompanying the charge. The United States lost around 205 men, along with about 1,200 wounded. The Spanish would lose about 213 men, with around 376 wounded. 2 days later, July 3rd, the naval battle of Santiago de Cuba would begin and end with the sinking of the Caribbean Spanish fleet. By August 13th, 1898, the Spanish-American War was over. John Hay, the U.S. Secretary of State, would call this a splendid little war. In Spain, the war was known as The 1898 disaster. The total casualties of the war came to around 5,000 Americans, most of which were from disease, as it's been estimated that only around 379 or so were from battle deaths. The Spanish death count came to around 20,000, most of whom died during the entirety of the rebellions on the islands. Many died on the high seas when the United States obliterated their fleets. These attacks left very few Spanish survivors in the battles, but thousands as prisoners on the islands. Chapter 2. A Pacific Power. The 1898 Treaty of Paris would end the war with an American victory. Now the question was, what did America want from this victory? It was feared by many in Congress that they might have to work with representatives of any newly acquired territories. As one congressman put it,
"How can we endure our shame when a Chinese senator from Hawaii, with his pigtail hanging down his back, with his pagan joss in his hand, shall rise from his curled chair, and in pidgin English proceed to chop logic? It may be that you will have a polyglot house, and it would be your painful duty to recognize, with fear and trembling, the gentleman from the Cannibal Islands, who will gaze upon you with watering mouth and gleaming teeth."
Representative Champ Clark of Missouri. To combat this, Congress would pass the Platt Amendment, a document ensuring that the United States would not outright annex Cuba. However, it would allow for American domination on the island for 60 years, until Fidel Castro would overthrow the American-backed government in 1959. This Platt Amendment gave America the right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it deemed it necessary. It further gave the U.S. preferential treatment for Cuba's sugar plantation, giving white planters on the island nearly unlimited power and wealth. The United States would exercise this intervention policy many times over the next half-century, not just in Cuba, but all over the Caribbean and Central America. Even without Cuba's direct annexation, the United States managed to get most of Spain's remaining overseas possessions. The treaty gave the United States Guam, Wake Island, the Philippine Islands, and Puerto Rico. The following year, in 1899, a war with the German Empire over the Samoan Islands would be averted by a quick armistice. It would be agreed that the islands would be divided in two, with a German Samoa and an American Samoa. To this day, the people of American Samoa must carry United States passports and are considered to be under the protection of United States law. But they are not given the rights of full citizenship. They would have to apply like other immigrants to be American citizens. All of these acquisitions would lead to America becoming a major Pacific naval power, alongside the German Empire, Empire of Japan, the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal. Chapter 3. The Philippine-American War. February 4th, 1899. As the Treaty of Paris made its way through Congress, a Filipino would be shot by an American sentry. This incident and others like it would cause the newly acquired Philippine Islands to erupt into the Philippine Insurrection, or the Philippine-American War. During the Spanish-American War, the Philippine rebels had been given assurances by the United States that they would be given their freedom. Instead, the United States reneged on their promise. Once the Filipinos realized that they had been backstabbed by the Americans, rebellion against their new overlords was only a matter of time. The United States would send General Elwell Otis to put down this rebellion. He promised that 20,000 men would win the war in a few weeks. Later, this number would become 35,000. Then, within the year, the number was 70,000. During the war, the Filipinos would be subjected to the same brutality that the Spanish had shown them. U.S. General Jacob Smith, one of the other commanding officers on the islands, ordered the mass burning of villages, quick summary execution of prisoners, and the torture of many civilians, whether guilty or not of insurrection.
"Burn all and kill all. The more you burn and kill, the more you will please me. Create in the minds of all the people a burning desire for the war to cease."
Very few of the perpetrators of this extreme violence ever faced justice. Only General Smith would be court-martialed for his actions on the islands, leading not to a conviction, but instead to an early retirement without any further consequences. One popular poem during this period was called The White Man's Burden, arguing it was the job of white people to bring civilization to the rest of the world. General Arthur MacArthur, father to future World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur, helped to negotiate the end of the war by convincing the Philippine president Emilio Aguinaldo to make peace. The war came to an end in 1902, after Filipino leader Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the United States. This war would end up with around 20,000 Filipinos dead from fighting, and around 200,000 dead from disease and hunger, though it's difficult to know how many of the dead were actual fighters. After the war, the newly created Philippine Civil Authority would take over from the military. This new commission would first be headed by future U.S. President William Howard Taft. He referred to the Filipinos as his little brown brother. Amongst many racists in the U.S., this would give Taft the reputation of being one of the Filipinos. This reputation of his would follow Taft all the way to the White House. The Philippines would eventually be granted full independence by 1946. Chapter 4. America's Sphere of Influence Expands. Back in 1899, as the Philippine-American War raged on, another rebellion was brewing elsewhere, this time in China. The rebels in this war would be poorly armed, but in such a great number that the ruling Qing dynasty had difficulties dealing with them. These rebels mostly fought in hand-to-hand combat. This conflict would be known as the Boxer Rebellion. This would be Smedley Butler's first assignment. During the rebellion, Butler would have earned the Medal of Honor for his actions in Shanghai, but at the time, commissioned officers were ineligible for the medal. By September 7, 1901, an 8-nation alliance managed to put down the Boxers. This alliance was made up of future World War I adversaries: the Germans, Austrians, French, British, Americans, Japanese, Russians, and Italians. 7 days later, September 14, 1901, President McKinley would be gunned down by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. The office then fell to newly elected Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt would create the Roosevelt Corollary, an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that gave the United States a right to intervene in any country in the Western Hemisphere. This ushered in the age of interventionism, or as President Roosevelt would call it, the job of America to speak softly, but carry a big stick. President Roosevelt would state further,
If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligations, it need fear no interference from the United States.
However, not all interventions would be limited to the Western Hemisphere. With the United States having Pacific and Atlantic fleets, the U.S. Navy would have to go around South America in order to reach each other. Luckily for them, in the country of Colombia, a French company had failed to complete a canal through the Northern Territory. When the Colombian government refused to cede the canal zone to the United States, it was decided that a small group of so-called freedom fighters in the Panama Zone would be propped up. These rebels would have the full weight of the United States Navy and Marine Corps forces behind them. When the peace was concluded, only the Colombians and Americans were present for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, not the new government of Panama, an indication of who was really in charge of the war. After the treaty was signed, the United States took over the Panama Canal Zone project, bringing it to completion by 1914. Smedley Butler would be stationed in the Canal Zone from the end of the war until its completion in 1914. He would operate out of this base when he and the Marines were needed in an intervention. His acts of heroism and his presence in American interventions would make him a household name in the United States. Chapter 5. The Banana Wars. With the victory in Panama, the United States would enter a period of time known as the Banana Wars, a phrase coined by William Sidney Porter, aka O. Henry. Though not all interventions here would be centered around the banana plantations, this was the name that stuck. Starting in 1903, when the people of Honduras rebelled against the American-backed government, the United States would send now Captain Smedley Butler with other U.S. Marines to put them down. From 1906 to 1909, the United States would occupy Cuba, exercising its right given to it by the Treaty of Paris to intervene in Cuba. Then again in 1912, when the Afro-Cubans faced oppression from the majority population, the U.S. intervened. The though it was done to protect their sugar interest, U.S.-owned railroads, and U.S.-owned roads on the island. The Afro-Cubans were not afforded any protection by the United States and would experience multiple massacres over this period. Finally, in 1917, after an allegedly fraudulent election in Cuba, the United States would intervene and remain in Cuba until after World War I. In 1909, Nicaraguan President José Santos Zelaya would be overthrown by an American-backed rebel. The United States once again sent Smedley Butler and the Marines. This intervention wound up granting the United Fruit Company exclusive rights to grow bananas in their country, as well as a large portion of the arable land in Nicaragua. Many other Caribbean nations would end up having large swaths of land seized by either of the two largest American banana companies, the two being the United Fruit Company and the Standard Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita and Dole respectively. These two companies dictated the future of many Caribbean and Central American countries, calling upon the U.S. government to send the Marines to intervene when rebels or nationalization efforts threatened their lucrative operations. On top of these exclusive planting rights to the two major banana companies, the international banking house of Brown Brothers was granted exclusive banking rights in Nicaragua. To obtain loans or pay off loans, this was the only bank Nicaragua could do business with. This was to ensure that Nicaragua paid off its new debt to the United States or risk an intervention.
What makes me mad is the whole revolution is inspired and financed by Americans who have wildcat investments down here and want to make them good by putting in a government which will declare a monopoly in their favor.
Chapter 6. Mexico's Troubles. While America intervened around the Caribbean and Central America, trouble was brewing in their southern neighbor of Mexico. Mexico had been ruled by corrupt despots time and again. The U.S. stepped in multiple times on the side of various despots. April 9, 1914. Mexican authorities arrested a group of U.S. sailors in the port city of Tampico. They were quickly released, however, not wanting trouble from the United States. However, President Wilson, who had been elected just a year prior in 1913, demanded more than just an apology. He wanted the Mexican government to give a 21-gun salute to the American flag. The Mexican government refused this request. Before getting congressional approval, President Wilson ordered U.S. Marines and sailors, including now Major Smedley Butler, to occupy the Mexican city of Veracruz. They landed in Veracruz with nearly 6,000 Marines. As the Marines and sailors advanced into the city, they found themselves being forced to fight street by street. By the time the Americans had secured the city, about 20 American sailors and Marines had died, with around 60 wounded. Mexico ended up with about 300 dead and over 200 wounded. Using Veracruz as a base, the United States was able to back Mexico's latest butcher, Venustiano Carranza, who was installed as the new president of Mexico. He would later have a falling out with infamous supporters Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, the latter of whom would be responsible for the deaths of many Americans. In the aftermath of the Battle of Veracruz, an unusually large number of military personnel wound up with the Medal of Honor. 56 American military personnel in all. 46 medals would go to the Navy sailors, 9 would go to the Marine Corps, and 1 would go to an Army soldier. Major Butler was one of the 9 Marines to receive this recognition, finally allowed to receive the medal after being denied before. This would be the first of 2 that he would earn in his career as a Marine. His citation reads,
For distinguished conduct in battle, engagement of Veracruz, April 22, 1914, Major Butler was eminent and conspicuous in command of his battalion. He exhibited courage and skill in leading his men through the action of the 22nd and in the final occupation of the city.
Major Butler, however, felt as though he didn't deserve the medal and tried to return it. When it was returned to him, he was ordered to wear it and wear it proudly. The U.S. intervention in Mexico was met with some mixed reactions at home. While some Americans supported the action, others criticized it as unnecessary. The intervention also drew condemnation from many South American countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, who viewed it as a violation of Mexico's sovereignty. When Pancho Villa started attacking across the American border, the U.S. would charge veteran commander of the Spanish-American War, General John Pershing, with capturing Villa. However, Pershing would be unsuccessful in this pursuit. Villa would instead be killed on orders by a future Mexican president, Carranza's successor, Álvaro Obregón. Chapter 7. The Banana Wars Continue. July 28, 1915. The latest Haitian dictator has been killed. President Wilson ordered Major Smedley Butler and his Marines to secure the capital, Port-au-Prince. As Butler and about 72 Marines attempted to secure Fort Riviera on the island, they were surrounded by a force about 3 times their size. The Marines eventually routed the Haitians guarding the fort. Only one Marine would end up injured, simply losing a couple of teeth. For his actions that day, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, would recommend Smedley Butler to receive his second Medal of Honor. This citation reads,
"For extraordinary heroism in action, as commanding officer of detachments from the 5th, 13th, and 23rd Companies, and the Marine and Sailor Detachment from the USS Connecticut, Major Butler led the attack on Fort Riviera, Haiti, November 17th, 1915. Following a concentrated drive, several different detachments of Marines gradually crossed in on the old French bastion fort in an effort to cut off all avenues of retreat for the Cacos. Reaching the fort on the southern side, where there was a small opening for attack in the wall, Major Butler gave the signal to attack, and Marines from the 15th Company poured through the breach, engaging the Cacos, took the bastion, and crushed the Cacos' resistance."
After securing Haiti, Major Butler was tasked with the administration of the island, restoring order to the nation, as well as bolstering protection of American business interests on the island. In particular, the National City Bank of New York, with which the new Haitian government was only allowed to take out or pay off loans. The largest agricultural winner was the American Sugar Company, who owned the monopoly on sugar in Haiti. With U.S. backing, Major Butler installed a new Haitian leader with a vote of 94-6 in the Haitian Senate, with Butler and his Marine detachment standing by to ensure the electoral victory. After the vote in the Haitian Senate, America kept 2,500 Marines in Haiti to secure an American-written constitution, which was also passed in a fixed referendum, with a vote of 98,225 to 758. The United States would occupy the nation until 1934, when President Franklin Roosevelt would institute his new Good Neighbor policy, ending many of the U.S.'s interventions in the Caribbean and Central America, at least for a time.
I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. Looking back at it, I feel might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 city districts. We Marines operated in 3 continents.
As the U.S. was busy securing its sphere of influence in Central America and the Caribbean, World War I had broken out in Europe. Soon, America would end up embroiled in the conflict. In order to understand America's place in World War I, or the Great War, it would be best to examine the leader of the U.S. at the time, President Woodrow Wilson. Chapter 8. Woodrow Wilson. 1902 to 1910. Before he was President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton University. During his tenure as university president, his tenure was marred by his controversial fight against modernizing Princeton's policies, which would have included allowing black students to attend the university. In contrast, all other Ivy League universities in the Northeast had already begun or were in the process of desegregating their schools. His work at the university gained him some notoriety, both positive and negative, but the press that he received propelled him to the governorship of New Jersey nonetheless in 1911. 1 year later, Wilson was nominated for the U.S. presidency at the Democratic National Convention after narrowly beating out then Speaker of the House, Champ Clark. He would go on to win the 1912 presidential election, facing off against incumbent President Taft, former President Theodore Roosevelt, and socialist Eugene V. Debs. Though only garnering 41% of the vote, with Roosevelt helping to split the Republican Party vote, that would end up being enough to win the presidency. During this time as president, workers' rights were increased, the U.S. cracked down on child labor, and women would eventually win their right to vote, though Wilson was initially against the last of these until it became apparent that the 19th Amendment would pass. While Wilson was progressive in these respects, he was still regressive in many others. Certain racial policies that were viewed as overtly racist at the time included segregating the U.S. Navy, which had never been segregated before, resegregating the federal government, and replacing all federal posts held by black workers in the southern states with all white workers. Wilson was born in Virginia, giving him a more southern upbringing, which involved being taught the historically inaccurate Civil War myth, the Lost Cause. He believed that the North had immorally imposed its will upon a helpless South. Further, Wilson allowed a showing at the White House of the KKK-inspiring film Birth of a Nation. This film showcased the Ku Klux Klan as the heroes of their own story, saving the white women from the, in their view, evil of the black race. The film even featured 3 quotes from Woodrow Wilson's historically dubious book, A History of the American People. Wilson was said to have been so impressed by the movie and its portrayal of black people that he is reported to have said,
"It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so true."
This film and Wilson's nonchalant attitude towards racial issues allowed the KKK to come back to the mainstream. This return of the Klan became known as the Second Klan, after the first having been forced underground during post-Civil War Reconstruction. As for his foreign policy, President Wilson would authorize the most interventions in U.S. history, all in the name of making the world safe for democracy and what he called moral diplomacy.
America has lifted high the light, which will shine unto all generations, and guide the feet of mankind to the goal of justice and liberty and peace.
Chapter 9. The Great War. June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was making a peace tour in recently annexed Bosnia. A group of Serbian nationalists, funded by the Serbian government called the Black Hand, were tasked with assassinating the Archduke. The first attempt at killing the Archduke that day had failed. A bomb meant for him ended up injuring the people in the car behind him. One of the few conspirators to get away, a young Serbian named Gavrilo Princip, decided to go to a local cafe to sulk and had even been contemplating suicide. The Archduke and his wife decided to visit victims of the earlier assassination attempt at a hospital. However, as fate would have it, a wrong turn by the Archduke's car would lead them to right in front of the cafe where Princip was at. This gave him the opportunity he needed. Princip got close to the car and shot both the Archduke and his wife. Ferdinand's last words were to his wife,
Sophie, don't die. Live for our children."
Austria-Hungary began internally debating on how to respond to the assassination. A few weeks later, on July 23rd, Austria-Hungary sent a list of demands to the Serbian government, kicking off the July crisis. During this crisis, Austria-Hungary had been backed by the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who had promised to come to their aid if attacked. Russia, who claimed Serbia as a protected nation under their own sphere of influence, started to mobilize troops on the borders of Austria-Hungary and the German Empire. France, who had an alliance with Russia, promised to back Russia if Germany and/or Austria-Hungary attacked. Serbia agreed to all but one of Austria-Hungary's demands. This wasn't good enough. July 28th. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, honoring its commitment to defend Serbia, declared war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declared war on Russia, and in response, France declared war. August 4th. Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, dragging the United Kingdom into the war on the side of France and Russia. More would be dragged into the conflict as time went on. The United States under Wilson, however, declared themselves to be neutral in the conflict.
The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. We must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as every transaction that might be construed as preference of one party to the struggle before another.
While the United States had significant trade deals and cultural ties with France and Britain, a large percentage of Americans could also trace their lineage back to Germany, with the German language being the most spoken second language at the time. Former President Theodore Roosevelt viewed the German intentions as unholy and wanted the United States to get more involved in the war from the start. His view was that the United States needed to flex its muscle, stretching its power and influence into the world. J.P. Morgan was the first significant American banker to hand out loans to the Entente members. He influenced many other bankers to start financially backing the Entente powers of France and the United Kingdom. During the war, about $7 billion would be loaned out in total. This would be around the equivalent of over $200 billion today. In contrast to J.P. Morgan, industrial titan Henry Ford threatened to pull his business from any bank seeking to or providing loans to the Entente powers. He was a supporter of Germany in this war. Ford's threat did little to dissuade banks from handing out loans to the Entente. However, if the Entente lost the war, it would have been impossible for the banks to recoup these loans. J.P. Morgan and other bankers started lobbying Congress for more shipments and support to the Entente powers to try and speed up the war, hoping that Germany would be exhausted much sooner. Instead, the war would drag on for 4 exhausting years. Britain blockaded supplies flowing into Germany and Austria-Hungary, choosing to stop any ships, bring them to a friendly harbor, offload their contents, and pay fair market price for what was on board. The ship would then be sent back to its country of origin. The German Empire did not have a navy powerful enough to enforce this kind of blockade. The Kaiser decided to go with a different approach: unrestricted submarine warfare. This strategy to try and scare the United States and other nations managed to do the opposite. May 7, 1915, the civilian ocean liner RMS Lusitania was sailing around Ireland when it was sunk by a German U-boat. 1,959 people were on board, with 1,198 dead. Among those dead were 128 Americans. Britain claimed that the passenger liner was simply a civilian vessel. Later, it would be discovered that munitions were in fact being transported aboard the ship. While Wilson used every diplomatic trick in the book to keep the United States out of the war, he finally called on Congress to allow for America to exercise preparedness, namely, preparing in case of war. Germany and Austria-Hungary took offense to this action, claiming that the United States was backpedaling on its promise of neutrality. Theodore Roosevelt would be highly critical of Wilson for not immediately declaring war. Over time, several other ships would sink with varying amounts of Americans on board. Every time a ship would sink, America would get that much closer to joining the war. March 6, 1916. Not wanting to drag America into the war, the German Kaiser ordered a pause on unrestricted submarine warfare. Tensions subsided a bit. It wouldn't be until January 19, 1917, that the German Kaiser would order unrestricted submarine warfare back on. January 1917. The German State Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Arthur Zimmermann, sent an encrypted telegram to Mexico's leader. When the Great War began, British intelligence had tapped into the communication cables that traveled from the United Kingdom to North America. As these were the only cables capable of reaching the New World, the German Empire had also used them as well for any such communications. The German Empire was fully aware that the British could tap into these cables. However, they were unaware that their code had already been broken by the British. The telegram sent by Germany had promised Mexico that if they were to join the war on the side of the Central Powers and invade the United States, Mexico would be given munitions and backing to take back some of the territory lost in the Mexican-American War. This offer would never be seriously considered by the Mexican government. The British, hesitant to share the details of the telegram for fear of revealing that the German code had been broken, eventually decided 2 months later, in March of 1917, to share the information with the American government. With the note becoming public and unrestricted submarine warfare back on, the American public had decided by majority to enter the war on the side of the Entente. April 2nd, 1917. The United States declared war on Germany. Chapter 10. America joins the fight.
The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind.
Many Americans with German backgrounds would have to hide their German heritage throughout this period until the end of the war. For fear of now being considered possible traitors, voices that would oppose the war would be locked up and censored by the government and the press. America would pass the Espionage Act in 1917, aiming to root out people deemed as traitors to the United States. This act would later be amended by the Sedition Act of 1918. Additionally, it would disallow any talk deemed to be disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language toward the United States. Thousands of people would be charged and locked up under these acts. However, many of them would eventually receive a pardon or clemency in 1920 from U.S. President Warren G. Harding. Unlike today, where troops and supplies could be flown and shipped in quickly, the process of getting American troops and supplies to Europe would take months. On May 18th, Congress passed the Selective Service Act. All men from the ages 21 to 45 had to sign up. This didn't mean that they would be drafted, but would be put into a random selection of men who could be called up. About 24 million men were signed up, with 2.8 million that were drafted. Eventually, with some old-fashioned peer pressure and a lot of propaganda promising some grand adventure in Europe, around 2 million men would volunteer by the end of the war. 400,000 of these men would be black soldiers, and as with other conflicts and interventions, they would be given some of the most dangerous assignments. Privates were to be paid around $30 a month, about half of which would be sent back to their families at home. Many soldiers would have to then spend $6 a month on accident insurance, leaving them with $9 by the end of it. Some were even coerced into buying Liberty bonds. These same bonds were collected in order to pay for the war, meaning many of the soldiers were effectively just paying for their own supplies. These soldiers, by and large, would not receive much profit from those Liberty bonds. Most would sell their bonds for pennies on the dollar when they got back from the war. It became even worse for some. With no GI Bill at the time, soldiers who came back wounded got the little help they could from charities, with almost no help coming from the federal government. Meanwhile, Wilson would establish the War Industries Board, which would be put in charge of the war's logistics. Their mandate would be to help mobilize the nation's abundant resources, retooling them for war. The head of the board would be Wall Street banker Bernard M. Baruch. The board would consist of a variety of captains of industry and banking. They were called dollar-a-year men because they donated their services for $1 a year in pay. Many of them would use their positions to dole out money and power to their friends and family in various industries, even if others were better suited to the task. So long as the war was won, the Wilson administration was willing to look the other way. This and other initiatives would be part of Wilson's new arsenal of democracy. For America's allies, she would become three things: the banker for the allies, the armory, and the breadbasket. The American entry into the war could not have come sooner. 1917 was a chaotic and especially bloody year for the war. A revolution in the Russian Empire would cause the Eastern Front to all but collapse. Fresh off his time chasing Pancho Villa around in northern Mexico, General John Pershing was put in charge of the growing American Expeditionary Force. June 26, 1917. The first American troops arrived in France. They ceremoniously marched through Paris, stopping at the tomb of the American Revolutionary hero, Marquis de Lafayette. While facing the tomb, American Colonel Charles Stanton announced, "Lafayette, we are here." It would take until April of 1918 for America to have built up a large enough force to get involved in battle. In a village near Seicheprey, the United States would sustain its first casualties, about 634 of them, and around 135 would be captured during the battle. The first American skirmish showed the naivete of the American commanders. They had just gotten their first taste of what war was going to be like in the 20th century. The Americans would bring their own unique way of fighting. The Germans, through diplomatic channels, would regularly lodge complaints about the American usage of shotguns. The usage of these weapons was thought by the Germans to be dishonorable. While the Germans were right about the shotgun being an extremely deadly weapon, the Germans were also the first to use one of the worst weapons in the war, chemical gas. Early in the war, American officers were ill-informed of the nature of the Great War and refused on many occasions to heed the advice given to them by the French and British officers, who had changed their tactics many years ago. American soldiers would be ordered into frontal assaults, similar to the futile attempts at the beginning of the war. Germany was ready for these kinds of attacks by now and would watch in horror as lines and lines of Americans would be cut down in brutal fighting all across the Western Front. General Pershing, for a while, refused to allow for Americans to be put under French command. General Foch, the French commander in charge of the American section of the front, would butt heads with Pershing on many occasions. Eventually, Pershing would begrudgingly allow for Americans to serve under French officers, leading to fewer deaths of American soldiers overall. June 1st, 1918, the first officially planned battle to take place with American troops happened in Belleau Wood. 5 German divisions would face down 2 American divisions, among which was a brigade of Marines. After many days of brutal fighting, the battle would, in effect, come down to a draw. The United States would suffer almost 10,000 casualties in this battle. One notable group of American soldiers was the Black Infantry Regiment, the 369th. These soldiers would also go by the moniker the Harlem Hellfighters. This name was given to them with respect by the Germans who faced them. The Hellfighters never lost ground, never had a man be captured, and never lost their honor. They would go through 191 days of brutal combat, the most any American soldier would ever have to endure. May 15, 1918, Privates Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts would come under fire by a German regiment. Completely surrounded and with their guns jammed, the fighting would turn to hand-to-hand combat. As the German soldiers were attempting to capture Needham Roberts, Henry Johnson pulled out a bolo knife and fought off the remaining Germans. He would receive 21 wounds, but finally, it was just Private Johnson and Roberts alone, injured but alive. This skirmish earned Johnson the German-given nickname Black Death as a sign of respect. He would be one of the most feared soldiers on the Western Front. The French, by the end of the war, would give out 150 Croix de Guerre to the Hellfighters. These medals were the highest military honor that could be bestowed upon foreign fighters by the French. Unfortunately, Henry Johnson would later die penniless and largely forgotten by the American public after the war. While they were alive, black soldiers were almost entirely left out of American medal ceremonies. Almost all of the Medal of Honor recipients were awarded the medal posthumously, and in most cases, wouldn't be awarded until the 1990s. Private Johnson's family wouldn't see his Purple Heart until 1996. Then, in 2002, they would also receive his Distinguished Service Cross. Finally, in 2015, Johnson would be awarded the Medal of Honor. By the end of the war, no black soldiers were allowed to march in the official victory parade. A parade for the Harlem Hellfighters and other black soldiers would have to be arranged by private citizens, and they were mostly limited affairs. July 14, 1918 would claim the life of one of the most famous American pilots, Quentin Roosevelt. He was the eldest son of former President Theodore Roosevelt. Quentin would be shot down over France and be buried there. At the news of his son's death, Theodore Roosevelt shut down, emotionally and physically, leading to his death later in 1919. Later in 1944, another of Theodore Roosevelt's sons, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., would die after the D-Day landings. General Roosevelt was the only general to land with the first wave at Normandy Beach. He specifically requested the assignment and wouldn't take no for an answer. He ended up leading one of the most successful landings of the day. He died a few days later and would be buried next to his brother, Quentin. On the Ottoman Empire front, the Young Turks would blame the Armenian population for the Ottoman Empire's losses that were piling on. In one of the often forgotten fronts of the war, the Turkish nationalists would seek to cleanse their land of the Armenian population. They would burn their homes, push them out to the Black Sea to drown, and use other horrible methods to kill as many people as possible. After it was all over, 1 million Armenians would be slaughtered. This heinous event would lead Raphael Lemkin in 1944 to coin the word genocide. By January 8, 1918, Woodrow Wilson would give a major speech on what he believed peace in Europe would look like. He would lay out his infamous 14 points in this address. His terms were less harsh than the ones being offered by the French and British. October 9, 1918, German diplomats made an attempt to conditionally surrender, with Wilson's 14 points being the basis of this surrender. The British and the French would refuse this attempt to surrender. November 11, 1918, 5 a.m. Germany agreed to an armistice. A few hours later, at 11 o'clock a.m., the war was over. General Pershing, though, felt that accepting the German surrender was the wrong idea. He wished for the German Empire to be completely crushed on the battlefield, as any surrender could mean that the Germans could come back one day to seek revenge. On the day of the surrender, General Pershing's area of operation would be unusual on the front. He had his men continue to order artillery barrages as well as unnecessary frontal charges across the front, not stopping until the war's ending deadline. 11,000 would end up dying on the last day of fighting. 3,500 of those would be Americans. Private Henry Gunther, an American, is thought to be the last casualty of World War I. General Pershing would never again command in any other major American-involved conflict. However, during the war, he, along with fellow General Fox Connor, mentored future World War II heroes such as future General and President Dwight Eisenhower, Generals George C. Marshall, Omar Bradley, and George Patton. Chapter 11. General Butler. War is a racket. Throughout this conflict, one notable officer was effectively put on the sideline. Recently promoted Major General Smedley Butler. Though he served in just about every major American intervention in the Caribbean and Central America, he was put in charge of logistics, well away from any action. His tendency to mouth off to higher-ranked officers constantly got him in trouble, as did his tenacious disobedience of orders that he felt were unwise. Here he would be given the nickname of Old Duckboard, due to his extensive usage of duckboard planks in the rebuilding of barracks in his part of the front. He would often speak out in defense of his Marines, as well as for all American fighters. General Butler's logistical experience in World War I would lead him to see more of the dirty side of war. While many brave Americans bled and died for their country, hundreds of people as well as companies got rich. For example, according to Butler, undershirts that cost 14 cents to make, the U.S. paid 30 to 40 cents each, netting a profit for them. General Butler made other claims as well. War was good for business. The United States would end up spending around $112 billion, or $2.25 trillion today, including loans given, all spent during the 4 years of the war. This is the equivalency of America's recent 20-year conflict in Afghanistan. The average pay for Americans did go up, however. At the beginning of the war, wages averaged around $580 a year. This would increase to about $1,300 a year by the end of the war. So the American worker wasn't completely cut out of the massive profits made. Chapter 12. The War's End. The 1918 U.S. elections would see the Democrats defeated in the House and the Senate, with the Republicans taking it back. Wilson was now facing a Congress with no taste for further international interventionism. Any peace settlement would have to go through the now hostile U.S. Senate, with Wilson's League of Nations potentially on the cutting block. Wilson proceeded to Europe nonetheless. The American delegation would be in Europe from January 1919 until June that year, laying out Wilson's vision of peace to a fairly unreceptive Entente. Most of the major powers wanted nothing to do with Wilson's peace or the less harsh terms that he was proposing. France and the United Kingdom had been fighting since 1914, while the United States had only joined in the last year of the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated the German throne by the end of the war, hoping for less harsh terms for Germany. This move would not provide Germany with any sympathies from the Entente nations, and would lead to the end of the German Empire and the beginning of a new republic. One proposal for the Paris Peace Conference was that the new German Republic would be broken up back into its previous states, a German disunification that would see the Prussian state reduced to a poor and practically defenseless nation. The fear of a Bolshevik-controlled Russia was on everyone's mind at the conference, so this option was now out of the question. France had lost territory to the German Empire in 1870 and wanted it back, plus some. But after some diplomatic moves by the United States and Britain, France would only be allowed its former lost territory in Europe. Since Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire had disintegrated by the end of the war, all blame would fall on Germany. France further demanded reparations to the tune of about $200 billion, or around $6 trillion in today's money. Britain would ask that Germany pay $120 billion, or about $4.5 trillion today. The agreed total would be $66 billion, or $2 trillion, paid out over the next few decades. Germany would have to take out loans from the United States in order to pay these war reparations to France and Britain, who would then turn around and use those reparation payments to pay back the United States for the loans the Entente had taken out. To put it another way, the United States was, at the end of the day, paying itself just a long way around. This would have ramifications later when the Great Depression hit. However, that will have to wait. Back in 1919, during the conference, President Wilson would sit as the head of various committees. In this committee, every vote had been decided by majority opinion. Wilson, without consulting his other delegates, unilaterally changed the committee rules for this one vote. Instead of a majority vote, this, and only this amendment, would require the vote to be unanimous in order to pass. This Equal Rights Amendment would be defeated, with Wilson quickly voting against it. After this vote was concluded, President Wilson then changed the rules back to requiring only a majority vote. The Equal Rights Amendment further soured relations with Japan and led them further into isolation. To the Japanese nationalists, this was proof that there would be no diplomatic path to recognition as a fellow great power. Another instance of hindsight came when a small delegation from French-controlled Indochina arrived in Paris to push for independence or, at the very least, further autonomy to the French colonial state. The Indochinese felt that the United States would be sympathetic to their cause, being a smaller state under oppression from a larger state, much like the US was before their revolution. Instead, the United States delegation refused to listen to their proposal. One of the Indochinese delegates was a young Ho Chi Minh, who would eventually lead his country of Vietnam to its independence many decades later. Though the United States had pushed for independence for other nations along ethnic and racial lines, the colonies of the victorious powers would not be granted independence. One of Wilson's major points was to have a League of Nations. These nations, led by the victors of the Great War, would be in charge of the peace in the world. This point would be quite divisive in the United States, which was already tired of Wilson's interventions. By the end of the conference, Germany would end up losing 13% of their territory to the new states of Poland and Czechoslovakia, as well as lands to France, Belgium, and Denmark. Denmark, though, took a lot of coercing to take the land that they did. Further, Germany would have to reduce its army size down to a meager 100,000 troops. They also could not have armed troops in the Rhineland region, nor any sizable air force. These rules would eventually be abrogated by the German Reich years later, without consequences. All countries, except for the United States, would sign off on the treaty. When Wilson brought the treaty back to the United States, instead of great acclamation, he faced a new Congress and a war-weary American people. The Senate would reject the treaty by a vote of 49-35, 7 votes shy of passing. The United States would not be joining Wilson's new League of Nations, neutering the League entirely. This embarrassing defeat, as well as a debilitating stroke that Wilson would suffer soon after, would put an end to Wilson's influence. The war would produce famines throughout Europe, from Belgium to the Soviet Union. An American businessman who had made his money overseas would step up to help lead the efforts to relieve European food shortages. His name was Herbert Hoover. Using his own money, he would start various programs to help with food relief. By the time the United States entered the war, Hoover had been put in charge of the newly created U.S. Food Administration. As the war started, Hoover had been made the food czar, in charge of the American food distribution in Europe. He procured about 23 metric tons of food for the Allies. Hoover also prevented major rationing in the United States by setting days for when people should eat certain foods. His policies would become known as Hooverizing.
Food will win the war.
His department was known to have been run with great efficiency, with Hoover managing various aspects of it to prevent corruption or misappropriation of funds or food. He would go on to establish the European Children's Fund, which provided relief to at least 15 million of Europe's children. Many of them had been displaced and lost their families during the war. When he started providing relief to the recently defeated German state, he experienced pushback from the victors. He provided relief anyway. Thanks to Hoover's lobbying, the Soviet Union would get food relief in 1920. At its peak, Hoover's organization, the American Relief Administration, would provide enough food to feed around 10 million people a day. An enthusiast once remarked that Hoover was the greatest humanitarian since Jesus Christ. Hoover would receive a commendation from the Soviet Union, with Politburo member Lev Kamenev stating,
"All of the people inhabiting the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics will never forget the aid rendered to them by the American people."
Lev Kamenev would later be one of many killed by Stalin's orders. Stalin would then go on to dismiss Hoover's relief efforts as capitalist subversion. Instead, Stalin would commit genocide against 7 million Ukrainians during the Holodomor. Russia was still in the throes of its revolution, the Bolshevik Reds versus the Whites. Neither side, by this point, could call themselves the heroes nor the villains. Both committed some of the most heinous crimes against humanity imaginable. As the war drew to a close, the Allies, along with the newly established German Weimar Republic, sent men, weapons, and supplies to the Whites, hoping beyond hope that a miracle would be performed. While the Whites were not heroes, the views and ideals of the Bolsheviks were too extreme for Western liberal countries to tolerate. About 12,000 Americans would be sent to Russia, while 2,845 of them would eventually become casualties in this intervention. The United States would eventually pull out of northern Russia by the end of 1919, and finally, fully pull out of eastern Russia by 1920. By the 1920 election, Wilson's failures would lead to a landslide victory for Warren G. Harding. The 1920s would be a Republican decade. It wouldn't be until 1933 that a Democrat would be back in office. The war's end brought change for the military as well. As the soldiers started coming back from the war, many of them were experiencing something new. At the time, it was labeled shell shock, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The United States and other governments had performed psychological tests on returning soldiers, determining that exposure to high stress over protracted periods of time would negatively alter the human brain's chemical makeup, causing intermittent heightened anxiety, as well as deadly flashbacks. The U.S. military ordered these reports buried. The U.S. government wouldn't acknowledge PTSD as real until the Vietnam War. Instead, soldiers were made to feel ashamed of their feelings. Many committed suicide. These people would be called cowards or crazy, when their only crime was serving their country. Chapter 13. Roaring Twenties. By the 1920s, the world was beginning to heal. Henry Ford has popularized his assembly line method, pushing out a car every 10 seconds. Optimism was in the air. The war had brought prosperity for some Americans, horrible repercussions for others. 40% of homes now have telephones, making communication easier and faster than ever before. 1 in 3 homes had a radio. In 1922, the world's naval leaders came together to sign the Washington Naval Treaty, hoping this would help ensure further peace. This treaty limited the tonnage of battleships and cruisers. It did not, however, limit the tonnage of the brand new aircraft carriers. This treaty would be modified in 1930 and 1936. Many countries would find loopholes and exploit weaknesses of the treaty. Despite the treaty, not all was well. A major stain on the record of the American military leadership would involve the trial of the Honorable American Colonel Billy Mitchell of the U.S. Army Air Service. During the Great War, he was in charge of American air combat units. Mitchell earned the Distinguished Service Cross, as well as the Distinguished Service Medal. He would give constant warnings to his superiors for their investing in too many capital ships. One of his warnings was that Pearl Harbor could be attacked by the Japanese. The American military leadership at the time denied this as a possibility. It was unfathomable that bombs could be dropped from planes and attack the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Mitchell also pushed for a separate air force to allow it to thrive, but this too was denied. He then accused the Army and Navy of sabotaging American aviation. After tiring of his loud and sometimes public complaints, the Army court-martialed him for insubordination when questioning American naval doctrine. He would sit in a show trial, which would end in his being found guilty of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. As a result, Mitchell's warnings would go unheeded. This, much like the naval treaty, would have implications in the decade to come. It would take until the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 for Mitchell's ideas about air power to finally be listened to. He would never live to see his prophecies come true, however. Billy Mitchell would die in 1936. His son would eventually receive his father's much-deserved Congressional Gold Medal, along with the nation's apology, in 1946. This medal was presented to his son by the Chief of Staff of the newly created U.S. Air Force. In 1941, the medium bomber plane, the B-25, would also be named after him. In the burgeoning world of flight, there was one name that stood out amongst American aviation pilots: Charles Lindbergh. In 1927, he would fly the Atlantic and become the first person to do so successfully solo. Lindbergh knew planes, and he understood what he needed to make the flight work. Lindbergh chose an older plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Unlike his other competitors, Lindbergh stripped down his plane to the essentials in order to reduce drag and weight. He took off from Roosevelt Field in New York and planned to make it to Paris. This was before the days of radar, and so he would have to carefully map out his location. Eventually, it would take him 33 hours, 30 minutes, and 29.8 seconds to make it to his destination. Even without instruments to tell him his location, he managed to make it to Paris, right as he planned. His other competitors lagged behind him, with many ending up landing hundreds of miles away. He arrived in Paris to tens of thousands of onlookers, all of whom wanted to see this handsome young American aviator. His star was born. In Paris, he'd received the Légion d'honneur, the first American to ever receive this honor. By the time he got home, he would receive a hero's welcome, even a ticker tape parade in his honor. Lindbergh would receive 35 million pieces of mail from across the globe. His name was said in just about every household in America. Even Walt Disney created the short Plane Crazy in Lindbergh's honor. Everything was looking up. The world, it seemed like, couldn't get any brighter. Chapter 14. Butler's Final Post. After the war, now Major General Smedley Butler, who had been involved in just about every U.S. intervention of the early 1900s as well as the Great War, would find himself pushed out more and more. In a speech, he made a remark that Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had run over a child with his car. The U.S. had sought to ally with Mussolini against the rising Bolshevik threat in Russia. As a result, Butler would never get his coveted position of Marine Commandant. Instead, Butler would be court-martialed, which was later rescinded. His final posting would see him be sent overseas again, this time back to the U.S. Shanghai Legation Zone in China. In Shanghai, Major General Butler witnessed a new conflict. The Chinese nationalists attacked the communists in the city. General Butler rallied his troops to defend the American Legation Zone, ordering his men to not fire unless fired upon. They could only sit back and watch the carnage unfold. By the end, almost 10,000 people lay dead in the streets. In China, this event would become known as the April 12th Incident. This was the beginning of the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists. This war would last from 1927 until 1949, with the defeat of the Chinese nationalists. General Butler was furious that he was disallowed to intervene. This would be the last time that General Butler would be in command. He would retire in 1931. Chapter 15. The Ku Klux Klan. Back in America, another threat was rising from inside the country: the Ku Klux Klan. After being revived due to the Wilson administration's lax policies toward the Klan, their membership would eventually rise to around 2.5 to 4 million members, though they would boast 8 million. The Klan had seeped its way into the U.S. government. During the period known as the Second Klan, members would go on to capture 11 Senate seats, 3 House seats, and 6 governorships, though many more had the full support of the Klan, even if they were not full members. This level of control gave the Klan and other violent racists a free hand to enact terror on black populations. Their violent behavior would culminate in one of the most violent time periods in American history. The 1920s might have been a roar for many, but to some, it was a time of absolute terror. In Tulsa at the time, a majority black population lived in a neighborhood called Greenwood, which was also known as Black Wall Street. It was full of booming businesses mostly owned by black entrepreneurs. May 31st, 1921. After a black man named Dick Rowland was accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, the white population rioted. Though Rowland was actually innocent of the crime, being released later on without charges. That fact did not matter to the rioters. Members of the black population in Tulsa gathered to defend Rowland from the white mob. Many of Rowland's defenders were the forgotten veterans of the Great War. By the end of it, 300 people would be dead, and Greenwood was burnt to the ground. The white rioters also garnered the protection of local police, so the black population didn't stand a chance. This would be the bloodiest race riot in US history. However, it would not be the only one. On January 2nd, in the town of Rosewood, another race riot broke out, resulting in the deaths of 6 more black people, whose bodies were hanged and desecrated. It would go on like that in many different cities and towns across the US, anywhere that white supremacists were prevalent, and in any place where they weren't, they would travel there, lynching anyone that they deemed to be an affront to their idea of purity. The federal government wouldn't pass an anti-lynching bill until 2022. August 8th, 1925. The Second Klan was at its peak. They would gather in Washington, D.C. for the largest demonstration ever seen in the country's capital. 30,000 members of that deranged group would march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Many supporters, sympathizers, and curious onlookers would watch the parade of white robes. Many of them gathered later to burn a large cross, as well as to desecrate a national monument with their false patriotism by laying a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. They would return on September 13th of the next year for another rally. It wouldn't be until the 1940s that the Second Klan activity would die down. This era would see its end. However, another revival of the Klan would eventually rise by the 1950s and 60s, just in time for the Civil Rights era to begin. Chapter 16. Great Depression.
Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry, people who are out of a job, are the stuff of which dictatorships are made.
In the financial sector, a cancer has been growing in the form of unregulated and out-of-control market speculation. While in the White House, a string of Republican presidents who had a relatively hands-off approach to the economy, also known as laissez-faire, meant that banks and other financial institutions could loan money without much oversight. America at the time made up about 40% of the world's production. It had, since the Great War, become the world's leading economic superpower. The new markets in Europe, after the violent collapse of Austria-Hungary, as well as the post-Russian Civil War conflicts, meant that the U.S. was still providing food and supplies for many in Eastern Europe. The American nation had gone through depressions before, but nothing like what was about to happen. Thursday, October 24th, would become one of the most memorable days in U.S. financial history. Very few suspected what was about to happen. The New York Stock Exchange was the largest of its kind. A few percentage points down wasn't the end of the world, but when it suddenly fell 11%, everything else around it came crashing down with it. That Thursday would become known as Black Thursday. By Monday, stocks crashed 12%, Black Monday. Tuesday, more of the same, 11% fall, Black Tuesday. It would take a decade before this depression would end. Entire savings wiped out almost in an instant. A new president had just been inaugurated a few months earlier. He was the food savior of Europe, the commerce secretary under Wilson's successors of Harding and Coolidge. He had tackled a crisis the world hadn't seen before and came out a hero. Now, it was Herbert Hoover's turn to try and do the impossible again. By 1932, however, Hoover was still struggling to reinvigorate the economy. He believed that limited economic intervention would be the key to revitalizing the economy. He would be proven wrong. Construction in the U.S. continued to fall, and was down well over $1 billion than in 1930. Hoover would sign a protectionist tariff to try and safeguard America's production. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, instead of helping the U.S. regrow its domestic economy, caused other nations to seek economic help elsewhere, with many turning to extremist ideologies out of desperation. Hoover's limited economic intervention did, however, lead to the building of the Boulder Dam, later renamed the Hoover Dam. The dam started construction in 1931 and finished in 1936. During the Depression, one event would underpin the sad and sorry state that America was in: the kidnapping of famed pilot Charles Lindbergh's child. In 1932, Charles and his wife Anne were home when someone had broken in and kidnapped their 20-month-old son. People were as horrified as they were captivated by the story, even going so far as to stalk the Lindbergh home, trampling around their home that much of the evidence outside was destroyed, making an already difficult case that much harder. President Hoover announced that the full might of the federal government would assist in the case. Even infamous mobster Al Capone would get involved. Capone would go on to call it the most outrageous thing I have ever heard of. The child would never be seen alive again. The boy's body would be found 2 months later, just a few miles outside the Lindbergh estate. Authorities would charge a man named Richard Hauptmann for the crime. After it was all over, the Lindberghs would travel to Europe to hide from the media, until the hysteria died down. Chapter 17: The Bonus Army. By 1932, unemployment was almost 24% and didn't look like it would be going down anytime soon. Almost 1 in 4 able-bodied Americans were out of work and desperate for any kind of payday. Some turned to crime. With prohibition still the law of the land, gangsters would often employ citizens to participate in various gang-related duties. Thanks to the 1924 World War Adjusted Compensation Act, World War veterans would eventually earn a bonus. Though President Coolidge vetoed the act, Congress overrode it. However, this bonus wouldn't be payable until 1945. That was still 13 years away. Many couldn't wait that long. Many banks started offering to buy those bonds at small percentages of the bond's worth. In some rare instances, more generous banks offered up to almost $86, though the payout could be up to $1,000 by 1945, which is around $8,000 today. Unemployed and desperate veterans were begging for the government to give them the full amount early. It's estimated that around 70% of Americans disapproved of the First World War, and about that many also disapproved of this extra expenditure, especially during a depression. With the public in mind, President Hoover wouldn't allow the bonuses to be given early. By summer of 1932, about 25,000 veterans and their families decided to go to Washington and demand their bonuses. At its peak, this would become one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. When the veterans arrived in Washington, there weren't many places to live or sleep, so many of them constructed tin and scrap homes, also called Hoovervilles, a term mocking President Hoover, giving him the blame for the state that the country was in. The camps they set up became a little town. They were desegregated with former black soldiers and white mixed together, sharing their small neighborhoods and meals together. These veterans would not have their cause be heard by most Washington politicians, though they would get some celebrity visitors. One such visitor was the now retired Major General Smedley Butler. He spoke to the marchers.
Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism, willing to take this beating as you've taken it, stand right steady, you keep every law. And why in the hell shouldn't you? Who in the hell has done all the bleeding for this country and for this law and this Constitution anyhow but you fellas?
During the Great War, these veterans had been called the American Expeditionary Force. These bonus marchers would get the name Bonus Expeditionary Force. President Hoover wanted nothing to do with these demonstrators, calling them communists and vagrants. He spoke to the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Douglas MacArthur, and ordered him to remove the protesters at any cost. General MacArthur had been in the service since 1903 and was known for being an effective commander during the Great War. He had been recognized by the French as one of America's finest officers. Now, though, he would have to kick out some of the same men who served with him. On July 28th, MacArthur was joined by his aide, future General and President Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well as tank genius and future General George Patton. These men, who would soon become household names by the next war, would be ordered to attack the heroes of the last war. And one of those camps was a veteran by the name of Joe Angelo. He had been decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Then Major Patton had been shot by machine gun fire. Private Angelo, under enemy fire, dragged Patton to safety, saving his life. During the Depression, former Private Angelo found himself needing the bonus early, like the rest of his fellow veterans. Now, though, it would be Patton who would end up driving Joe Angelo out of the camp. The encampment had even become quite the tourist trap while it was up, with many civilians having visited it. Suddenly, without warning, General MacArthur ordered cavalry charges into the camp. Almost none of the veterans had weapons and were defenseless against the US military. Patton would soon join in the fray with a small tank brigade. MacArthur and his men set the camps ablaze. The camps and the people in it were going to be destroyed, one way or another. By the end of it, 2 veterans had died, with around 55 injured. The American public may have disapproved of the bonus, but they absolutely did not approve of the violence. President Hoover, hero of the starving and sick during and after World War I, now had become the villain of the Depression era. When he ran for re-election later this year, Hoover would only carry 6 states. Franklin Roosevelt would win the rest in a landslide. Hoover's reputation would be ruined for years, only recovering slightly in 1947 due to his work in the Hoover Commission. Even so, he's now typically listed by historians as one of the worst presidents in American history. America's future had gotten so bleak that when Roosevelt was elected in 1932, a visitor came up to him and said, "Mr. President, if your program succeeds, you'll be the greatest president in American history. If it fails, you will be the worst one." FDR replied, "If it fails, I'll be the last one." Recently elected Franklin Roosevelt would have to face the bonus marchers again the following year. This time, employing a different strategy, he would send Eleanor Roosevelt to speak to the marchers, finally giving them a peaceful acknowledgement. This would lead one of the marchers to remark, "Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife." Roosevelt's New Deal would employ a variety of programs to help uplift the American economy, as well as its spirit. One of his new programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Though typically for young men, Roosevelt decided to make an exception. He offered the marchers work in the Conservation Corps. Most took the deal, and with that, this bonus army would disperse without incident. Chapter 18: Rise of Fascism. The Depression put a massive strain on democracies around the world. Some held firm, but others utterly collapsed. Germany, who was still taking out loans from the United States to pay back the Allies from the Great War, had what was viewed outwardly as a thriving economy before the Depression. When the Depression hit America, most loans to Germany from America had to stop. Without the loans from America, it was impossible for Germany to pay back the Allies. Hyperinflation set in, and the Deutschmark was now effectively useless. German citizens were even using wheelbarrows of money in order to pay for bread. Germany turned to the Nazi Party, who had promised a better life, as well as the undoing of the Versailles Treaty's draconian measures. While Mussolini started the fascist movement, Hitler popularized it further throughout the world. The British would have their own black shirts, Mexico had the gold shirts, while in the United States, a man named William Dudley Pelley would create the silver shirts, or the Silver Legion of America. Most in America wouldn't take them seriously. Another American fascist group was the German-American Bund, who had been closely associated with Nazi Germany. They would hold a rally at Madison Square Garden on February 20th, 1939. This rally would feature an American vibe, with posters of George Washington, American flags, and other American fanfare. Around 20,000 people would attend this rally. It even featured American fascists dressed similarly to Nazi stormtroopers. During the rally, protesters were attacked by these American stormtroopers. As fascists, they couldn't help but be violent. Just like all fascist regimes, the Bund was run by frauds. Their leader, Fritz Julius Kuhn, was later found to have been embezzling the group's money. The German-American Bund soon fizzled down to nothing. This attempted Nazi infiltration of the United States failed. Chapter 19. The Business Plot. 1933. 1 year after the Bonus Army had been violently dispersed, newly elected President Roosevelt got to work on his reshaping of America through his New Deal programs. Many American industry giants viewed this New Deal as communist in nature. After the Great War had ended, the Italian government would be overthrown in a fascist coup headed by Benito Mussolini through a march on Rome. These industrialists, having viewed Mussolini's successful march on Rome as an inspiration, hatched a plot to overthrow the American government and install their own strongman to take on the communist threat. Some of the alleged conspirators include Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan Jr., Wall Street financier Grayson M.P. Murphy, World War I U.S. Admiral William Sims, and many others. Smedley Butler would be one of the targets of this seditious conspiracy. In 1932, after the Bonus Army had been violently dispersed, those bonus soldiers still had nowhere to go for help, except for the American Legion and other veteran groups. The business leaders needed a strong leader as well as an army, and there were a bunch of unemployed veterans. The plan was to have Butler lead an army of 500,000 men to take over the White House. Butler would attend these American Legion meetings and speak to the men, much like he did during his speech at the First Bonus Army, while subsequently attacking the Roosevelt policies. Then, he'd provoke the men, arm them, march on Washington just like Mussolini, and take over the government. After being approached multiple times by the coup leader's frontman, bond salesman Gerald McGuire, Butler invited Paul Comely French, a reporter for the Philadelphia Record, to sit in on some meetings with McGuire. After a few meetings, Butler and French gathered their evidence and handed it over to Congress, specifically the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which was a predecessor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. After hearing everyone's testimony, the committee would close with no arrests made. However, the committee's final report would say,
In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient.
Despite all their work, Roosevelt would succeed in transforming the federal government into an integrated part of American society. Never again would the federal government be as uninvolved as they were before FDR. Major General Smedley Darlington Butler would later die of stomach cancer on June 21st, 1940. He was 58 years old. At the time of his death, he had become the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. Chapter 20. America First. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had defied the Treaty of Versailles. First, he rearmed Germany. Next, he marched his troops into the Rhineland. Then, he annexed Austria. All of these actions were supposed to be banned by the Treaty of Versailles. After that was the Munich Conference, where the Allied powers of France and Great Britain gave Germany Czechoslovakian land without consulting the Czechs. The Allied powers finally drew a line at his new demands for Danzig from Poland, which divided Germany from their Prussian lands. The majority of the United States had zero interest in being involved in another European conflict, as well as still recovering from the Great Depression. A major lobbying group would be formed to attempt to keep the United States out of the conflict. The America First Committee, made up of a wide spectrum of Americans, from socialists to fascist sympathizers. One of the founders of the America First Committee was Henry Ford, who in 1919 bought a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Ford would write for this paper. His writings would put a blame on Jews for any of the world's ills. One avid reader of his work was a young Adolf Hitler. Ford's writings would help inspire Hitler's ideology, with Hitler, who had a portrait of Ford on his desk, stating in an interview,
I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration.
Hitler further compliments Ford in his biography and evil manifesto, Mein Kampf, by saying,
Jews are the regents of the stock exchange power of the American Union. Every year, they've managed to become increasingly the controlling masters of the labor power of a people of 120 million souls. One great man, Ford, to their exasperation, still holds out independently there even now.
When Ford came to visit Germany to give his insights and input into their manufacturing sector, Hitler awarded him with the Grand Cross, the highest honor a civilian could obtain. Ford would eventually apologize for his writings, but the damage was done. William Randolph Hearst's papers ran headlines that supported the Nazi cause. Even famed pilot Charles Lindbergh would join America First. He would state in speeches and in the press,
I am not attacking either the Jewish or British people. Both races I admire. But I am saying the leaders of both the British and the Jewish races, for reasons which are not American, wish to involve us in the war. If any one of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement.
This particular speech would ruin his reputation for a time. President Roosevelt would say, I am absolutely convinced that Lindbergh is a Nazi. Lindbergh would never repent nor apologize for this speech. The America First Committee would, from 1939 until 1941, be a powerful lobbying group for isolationism. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the America First Committee would end, and the members would release a statement.
Our principles were right. Had they been followed, war could have been avoided. No good purpose can now be served for considering what might have been had our objectives been attained. We are at war. Today, though, there may be many important subsidiary considerations. The primary objective is not difficult to state. It can be completely defined in one word: victory.
Charles Lindbergh would apply to be a pilot for the war, but his suspected Nazi sympathies kept him from officially joining the conflict. He, however, would go to Europe to inspect, inform, and train pilots. While in Europe, he decided that it would be best to inspect the bombing runs personally. So, while he was given no commission, he took part in the war and served his country one last time, bravely. Chapter 21. The End. When World War II began, the country completely shifted into a war economy. The Great Depression was over, and the country was employed again. Millions more men and women would serve in this war than in the previous. The non-interventionists had lost, and the United States would never again isolate itself from the rest of the world. The good neighbor policies from post-Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt would end, with intervention back as a mainstay in American foreign policy. The military-industrial complex was here to stay, creating a powerful lobby in Congress, with defense spending constantly on the rise. Millions of men and women have served in the armed forces, with the stated goal of protecting America and her interests, whether those interests be good or ill.
When this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. When I get my civic clothes on, oh, how happy I will be. No more church parades on Sundays, no more putting in for leave. I will kiss the sergeant major. How I'll miss him, how he'll grieve. When this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. When I get my civic clothes on, oh, how happy I will be. No more standing to in trenches, only one more church parade. tickler's marmalade. When this lousy war is over, no more soldiering for me. When I get my civic clothes on, oh, how happy I will be. People said when we